Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, her Vietnamese non-Buddhist memoir, Seeking Spirit, out now through Guernica Editions. Linda Trinh joins me on the program. Welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. There is lots to unpack from this book, and it seems like you did a lot of unpacking of yourself in the book. I want to start with Inanna. And
Inanna? Yeah.
Inanna, in particular, because at one point in the book, you join the Manitoba Writers Guild and you get a mentor, and they give you a book on Inanna, but you'd been a reader of sorts before that. Like, were you familiar with Inanna before that, or like timing wise, is that when you discovered Inanna?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think I had been aware of her story beforehand, and I was trying to create like an essay around it that became chapter 3 in the book. And so it was fate. It was the universe giving me a sign, right, that I was connected with this mentor through the Writers Guild. And so she knew so much more about her and gave me a book to study. And so when we actually went through it, the path of that essay and of my journey, kind of like trying to put the pieces together, the meaning together, made a lot more sense.
Yeah, I was very curious because it comes earlier in the book, the Inanna portion, than when you meet this mentor. And, you know, in piecing things together, like, I gather that obviously some of these sections of this book were previously published essays and have been recontextualized to be part of this book. And how much of this is kind of like an Ouroboros, or like, you know, maybe even a labyrinth, like a mandala style labyrinth where you're kind of circling yourself.
Yeah, well, I think definitely for the book itself, the structure, the form of which I use to put meaning to, like, as you said, unpacking some of these life events, but also these teachings, these learnings through mythology, through cultural touchstones, but also through experience. It was very important to me to showcase, okay, it's not just the content that is very important, but it's also the form in which it is presented, because in that way, that is also meaningful.
Does that come from your being a reader?
Definitely. I mean, I also enjoy reading memoir, but also reading like any other kinds of nonfiction, fiction. But I think it's also the way just my mind works, or a curiosity about different things as well. Sometimes reading, it's very linear. It's very, words on a page, right? This sentence, like this word after this word, this sentence after this sentence. So also just trying to think about structure in a way that, okay, there are words on a page, but also how could you play around with it? How could it, make meaning in the sense of like visually, what could it look like? Or how does one theme relate to a different theme? So in chapter 3, when I'm talking about Iana, it's talking about her story of going into the underworld and the gates that she is confronted with. And so how does that relate to my own life, following her story, but also relating it to my own?
Right. Now, obviously, there's like a layering or like an unpacking of layers that happens to Inanna, and you contrast that with your own sort of journey, and there's like garments being kind of unthreaded.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something like that reading of Inanna at that point with your mentor providing you the book that you started to see that, or how did you kind of come up with that contrasting?
I think it was around the idea of, I've always had an interest in different mythologies around the world, and they've been interesting to me, perhaps as a kid, just as an interesting story. And then as an adult, it's like, well, what were these stories meant to showcase, or meant to, ancestors who lived long ago in different parts of the world? And so I think it was trying to find a personal connection to this. It was around the idea of reading these stories of, okay, so this is what the goddess embodied, and what the garments she had to take off. but also for my own personal life, just being a heroine in my own life, how does that relate to me? So I was thinking of it more as things I had to learn, but things I also had to unlearn. And I never thought about that as a child reading mythology. It really came as an adult. The unpacking is it's so important to learn things, but it's equally important to figure out the things that you want to leave behind.
How do you go figuring that out?
Well, like like in the book itself, it's a lot of self-reflection. It's a lot of making meaning out of things. As you can see throughout the book, I try to take an external journey, right? Trying to find pieces of myself, wisdoms around the world, going to Egypt, going to China, going to Vietnam. And I was very lucky. I was very privileged to be able to have those experiences and find those clues. And then knowing those things, going back to, well, what does that mean for me when I'm getting up and going to work, when I'm, caught in the ordinariness of life? What pieces can I hold on to? And so the book itself is also an internal journey through life events, grief, joy, and yeah, just trying to do that hard work, that heart work of finding myself.
During those travels, the external travels and not the internal ones, was it purposefully with that intent of finding meaning, or were you traveling and then in reflection you're seeing that what you were doing was trying to find meaning?
I think perhaps it was a little bit of both. I've always been um, wanting to be pulled towards sacred spaces. So, for example, going to Egypt, that was something that I've always wanted to do since I was a kid. So, a lot of the sites you go to, the pyramids, Abu Simbel, have meaning already, not just as a tourist attraction, but also because it was so sacred to ancient Egyptians. So, that was the pull of it. And then hoping that I would find something more when I was there. And yeah, sometimes it was just like, this is a really cool space. And other times, what I've written in the book, this was something that went beyond that for me.
The book itself, as I said, there's essays that you've reworked. At what point did they cease to be individual essays and become like the foundation for what this book is?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Well, the book took me about 7 years to write, with the kind of the sparks of the first few essays. And so I think perhaps as I was like having maybe more than 50% of it, and I think it was the middle section that I kind of pieced together, well, here's some essays that make sense, and then here's some things that could fit at the end, but really I could put it together in the sense of this is talking through my own like imaginings and, like you said, unpacking of trying to find meaning. So I think when I was writing it and trying to figure out the structure itself, that's when I knew it could be a collection.
So at that point, what is the work of going to the older stuff, and like, are you completely rewriting it, or are you shaping it in such a way that it seems like it's part of the larger through line? Like, how do you go about fitting it in?
I think it was not necessarily rewriting it, but sort of like where would it fit necessarily in the book itself? Like, would it be the first section, the second section, the third section? Because really, it kind of emerged as in the first section was I was looking at studying spirit, right? Looking through the books themselves, more of like an academic lens. And then the second section being a spirit experienced. So, how that all fits together. And the third one, like actually practicing spirit. So, knowing what those three parts would be, it made like a natural fit of they would go. And then what I found the interesting part of memoir, like you're looking at your memories, you're remining the things that happened to you, but at the same time, there needs to be a point of which okay, this is the self that I am doing the revisions. So for example, there are essays, I think in the latter parts where my daughter is 7. So she's 13 now. So as I was revising them, I still had to think of myself when she was 7. It couldn't be a revision of, okay, well, this is who I am when she is 13. So I think there needs to be a point at which just to make those decisions as an author.
Does that create like any psychological schisms?
Um, it's memoir is there is the thrill of writing creative nonfiction, writing memoir, and there are challenges and there are ways, yeah, and there are parts sometimes that I have to take breaks and walk away because every time I'm doing revisions, um, I'm editing it for content and for craft, but at the same time, I'm reliving a joyful experience. I could also be living a traumatic experience. So I also had to make sure I took care of myself doing those things.
Right. So there's like a protective layer that you have to.
Yeah, it's an interesting endeavor because you're doing it as the writer, looking at it from a craft point of view, but also this is still my life. This is still content, and yeah, making sure that like I'm in tune with myself and walking away and taking breaks if I need to.
In the acknowledgments, you write of Make You Wong helping you figure out what you needed to write and what you wanted to write. And I'm curious about the distinctions you draw between those two things.
Um, I think I had a sticky note when I was working with her. I think the sticky note said, "What serves the narrative?" So again, the trickiness of memoir and the challenge, and I love reading it. Um, I had lots of maybe notes or lots of ideas around around my life events. But at the same time, it's different than I'm just journaling these events or I'm, talking to a close friend about, oh, what happened to me a few years ago or what happened to me last week. It was more so, what was the story I wanted to tell? What was the narrative? What was the theme of the book, the theme of the chapter? And what I what I was writing, would it serve that? So that's really what she helped me figure out and mine deeper into that.
So was that in looking at each section, or was it a specific like the third section? If
Um,
like where you're actually practicing versus researching or seeking.
I think we did it throughout the whole aspect of it. Perhaps more of like the second section and then the first chapter of the third section. Yeah, like you were talking about, like practicing it, but also what are my what did I learn for myself from that? So it was talking about, what I actually did, but also, well, can I reflect and say, well, how is that important to me? Versus just I did this and then I did this and then I did this.
Yeah, that it's not just a diarizing, but
Hmm.
a like an exploration. And how ready were you to do that work to like plumb your own depths deeper?
It's it's an interesting thing to do. I think the memoir, even though it took me 7 years, probably was more years in coming. And so it was work that I needed to do for myself. And hopefully, in writing it as well, it's like, okay, well, I'm doing all this work, I'm putting myself through all these challenges. I hope at the same time, it's like, well, I'm doing it because, there's something in this story that could be relatable, that, could mean something to somebody else. And so just trying to think of those ideas, like writing it as a writer, then hopefully revising it as a reader. Um, yeah, those are the things that kept me going.
Is that tied to your own, reading and seeking meaning through other readings that like you're thinking about your chronicling as being kind of part of that conversation or lineage?
I mean, I think it all goes back to how do we connect through community? How do we, um, find empathy and relatability? So part of it probably comes from the fact that I didn't see a lot of like Asian stories or stories about people who grew up as an immigrant, trying to find that belonging, but not quite belonging, being seen as the other. And so, yeah, I think that was something that I was searching for through like books or media. And yeah, wanted to tell my own story.
In addition to the like spiritual seeking, you obviously chronicle some of your workplace travails. And working in HR, you quote this thing about change and transition that
Mm-hmm.
like ultimately has like spiritual aspects to it.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, did you kind of end up in HR unknowingly, like as part of your spiritual journey?
Oh, gee, that's a good question. It was, part of it being I needed to go out and get a practical degree, with my mom being a single parent and getting a Bachelor of Commerce. There was only a few, there were some majors to choose from. And I think human resources was the one that spoke to me the most. It was interesting. I talk about like going through, yeah, changes at work, um, coming upon the work of William Bridges. And he talks about change and transition at work, kind of in the context of Moses and the Exodus and leading the Israelites out of Israel. So that was something that, oh, I didn't know that we could talk about work in that sense. So that's really something that was a theme that I could weave back into the book itself. It's like, well, it's already out there. It could be something that could be meaningful to other people. And yeah, I think through HR, working with other people, bumping up against their lives, trying to connect with them is something definitely weaving through my work, looking at spirituality around finding meaning, finding purpose. So I do think it's all connected.
Yeah, particularly because I've heard it said, people are meaning making machines. We
Mm-hmm.
seek to make meaning, but we're also like connection making machines, right? Like we try to
Yeah.
create family or at least, establish family dynamics, even in places where it's not necessarily family, right?
Mm-hmm.
That maybe you, as someone who was always seeking this, right? Because even when you talk about, your early days as a reader, it seems to be centered on these kinds of larger questions
Mm-hmm.
that subconsciously you were finding the one place within that realm that you could do this work.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think once, like people have different parameters, different expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, growing up with my single mom, it wasn't, oh, well, I can go study whatever I want to study. I can go major in English or I can, in creative writing or something like that. It's like, okay, I think I've picked business because that's very practical. That makes sense. But within those parameters, how do I find the most meaningful
Mm-hmm.
kind of work that I can? And I do agree with you. I think, as I watch my children grow up and I still have my day job and I'm, connecting through to young readers, like through my work as writing my kids series. I do think it is about connection and finding your place in the world and how can you, yeah, connect to those around you. I think that's one of the most valuable things.
And ultimately, as you said, you when you first write and get your first published paid piece, that like you find your voice, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in order to make that connection, you need to speak about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think any kind of creative endeavor, whether it's writing, art, cooking, dancing, there is a part of yourself in that expression, and you can be influenced by different things. You can have different inspirations, but hopefully there is a part of you in it, and that is your offering. That is what I always think of it. That is my offering into the world.
You'd mentioned obviously the bridges refers to the Moses example with the dog, but at one point you say, you're no longer Moses, you're Joseph. And
Yeah.
I'm curious about what you saw in Joseph or in yourself as Joseph in that moment.
Well, I think it's like in the context of something else is needed. It is that idea of adapting, it's that idea of unlearning. If I am exactly who I always was, is that what is needed for the next challenge? So whether I think of that in the context of my workplace or whether I think of that in context of being an author, if I didn't grow and do some kind of self-reflection and work on myself and remained Moses, would I be able to, if we take it further, cross into the promised land? I think I I don't believe so for myself. I think I would need to change and to transform in a certain way to be able to um, be what is necessary for the next challenges and the next uh, way into the world. And I think that's great. I think that idea of transformation and adapting is is something positive.
Right. And as you know, that's transition, right? That it's
Mhm.
psychological. It may be slow. The changes are the external things, and then they may happen quickly. And how you react is kind of up to you.
Exactly. And part of it is letting go of expectations, I think is very challenging. It was very challenging for me through different parts of my life, and perhaps it's challenging for other people as well. It's the idea of what we thought we should have or what we thought we wanted, and when that's no longer the case because of external factors. I think I also write like I was in my own way. I was the one that was setting myself up for, if things were different, but they're not different. So yeah, that those were hard lessons to learn.
Those are lessons you learn in part during your pregnancies.
Hmm.
And I'm curious about kind of like were you reluctant or reticent at all to write about those periods, or was that core to kind of what work you had to do internally, and so you couldn't have written this without revealing some of that?
Yeah, I think for the second section, it talks about my pregnancy and my subsequent miscarriage. And so in the book itself, I talk about how I silenced myself and not being able to discuss it with family and friends. And so in putting the book together, I did find that that was something that I needed to write about and go through and to write about it, to talk about it, to kind of reclaim that memory and to, um, put voice to it, put that it was something that happened in my life and it was something that was a valuable experience that, um, led me to some other learnings and understandings.
Because it also seems to tie into like your notion of like expectations, right? Like you have kind of like, oh, this
Hmm.
baby's going to be born at this time so that
Yeah.
I don't have
Yep.
another baby in the
Yep.
winter. And that you kind of got ahead of yourself with those expectations, and then you're forced to reconcile that with what ends up happening. Could you have
Yeah.
kind of gone through this without that, or like is it part and parcel of that like journey for yourself in terms of around expectations and learning to kind of let some of that go?
I think definitely it's the journey. I'm not sure if other people may be able to relate to that. For me, I love to plan, to see what's ahead, you know, sometimes I just think that things will just work out exactly how I plan them to be. So I've noticed that in myself. I've seen that in other people around me as well. And so just to know that it doesn't always work out that way, to be humbled in that sense, and to, um, yeah, to actually understand that things are not within my control. So when I wrote that, I was being sincere about it. I did think that I could plan these things through sheer force of will. And so the hubris of that, right? And yeah, just going through life and having those life experiences. It's like, well, you just don't always get what you want. But at the same time, life is also wondrous and beautiful, and there are moments and takeaways from it.
Did those lessons help you as a writer? Like once you've kind of put a book out into the world, you don't have control over kind of the readers?
Oh, yeah, that's a really great question. Yes. I have been advised not to read reviews on Goodreads, and I have not. um, it is the idea of this is my book baby, and now I've sent it into the world for it to have its own journey, to find its own place. And yeah, it's the idea of I've done what I can, and now it's no longer in my hands. Not to say that that is an easy lesson. Sometimes I'm still relearning it, but it's definitely a valuable one that I've learned throughout life. And as you said, it does help me as an author in terms of, well, this is the content that I can write. These are the relationships that I can make, but the things that I can't control, are there rejection letters in my future? Um, what reception the books actually get. I have to manage those expectations, and it's like, well, that's beyond my control now.
Ultimately, I guess, it's one of the things in the book is that like learning is not a fixed thing. That there's
Yeah.
always more learning to be done. Seeking Spirit, a Vietnamese non-Buddhist memoir, is out through Guernica Editions. Linda, thanks very much for joining me on the program, and congratulations on its release.
Oh, Michael, thank you so much for having me.